The weather is warming up. Are you ready to get your hands dirty? Stay tuned. I have 10 gardening activities for you to do. Hi, I'm Melinda Capp with Melinda Capp Homes. Welcome to my channel. The English poet Alfred Austin said, "The glory of gardening, hands in the dirt, head in the sun, heart with nature. To nurture a garden is to feed not just the body, but the soul." I don't know about you, but this sounds like something I want to jump into right now. I love being outside, studying how I want to lay out the garden and then proudly watch as it grows and produces the fruit of my labor. I can't beat that. But while I wait, I have to fight to keep my chickens out of the dirt and the deer from eating all of my plants. It's a constant battle that keeps me on my toes. How about you? Do you have that problem? So let's start with the tips that I have. Tip number 1, start feeding your roses. Roses typically begin their growing season in March with the stem and foliage returning. So if you haven't already started feeding your roses with a rose fertilizer, and then follow with a regular monthly feeding schedule throughout the growing season. Caring for roses organically starts with proper soil, but you also need to create an ecosystem within your rose garden that attracts the beneficial insects, such as ladybugs. They'll eat the aphids and other pests. And did you know your local hardware store like Lowe's or Home Depot, they sell ladybugs? Go check it out. Keep in mind though, roses should also get really good air circulation and light. Tip number 2, add annuals to hanging baskets, containers, and window boxes. So if you don't have a lot of room to plant, one of the easiest ways to add color is by planting annuals in hanging baskets and containers and the window boxes. You can begin by planting cool season annuals that will bloom early, like larkspur, petunia, oriental poppies, daisies, and violas. Look, I sound like I know what I'm talking about. Then include later blooming annuals such as snapdragons, hollyhock, and geraniums. Tip number 3, continue planting spring planted bulbs. Get your bulbs in the ground throughout March. When planting most bulbs, you're going to want to dig a hole about 2 to 3 times the depth of the bulb for height. For dahlias, dig a hole about roughly 6 inches deep. Bulbs can survive in very lean, nutrient-deprived soil. They flower best, though, in well-drained, nutrient-rich soil. So when planting, mix in some compost and some fertilizer, and then water them well. You can typically wait to do a supplemental water until the foliage comes out and the flowers start developing. If you still have rainfall, this will usually provide you with enough moisture before the foliage emerges. But if your weather is unusually dry like ours is, you'll want to give your bulbs a deep watering once a week. Which leads us to number 4, plant citrus trees. March and April is a really good time to plant citrus trees here in Northern California. The weather is still a little cool and often wetter conditions that will help your tree roots establish more quickly. But when planting citrus, be sure to select a location with full sun, at least 6 hours of direct sunlight a day, and preferably a little bit more. And always well-drained nutrient soil. Trying to avoid highly compacted soil, such as heavy clay, in areas that stay wet. For backyards, it's often best to select semi-dwarf trees, which I absolutely love, because they don't get too large. Smaller trees mean that you can fit more varieties into your garden, and the fruit is going to be much easier to pick. So tip number 5, cut back your perennials. I have to say, this one is super hard for me because I have many panic attacks when taking the clippers to my garden. If you haven't already, cut back those perennials and ornamental grasses. Don't worry, new growth will emerge soon and your garden won't look bare for very long. Then fertilize your plants to help rejuvenate them with a slow release fertilizer and a generous layer of compost. If your soil is compact, well, just loosen it up around the perennials and grass with a shovel so it opens up some of those channels in the soil to let the air, the water, and the roots so they can penetrate in more easily. And number 6, leave foliage on spring blooming bulbs. That's a hard one to say. So after the blooms on your spring blooming bulbs fade, leave the foliage intact while it's still green. This will restore the nutrients to the bulbs, and that will be used to produce flowers for next year. You can also continue to fertilize and water the bulbs while the foliage is green. This is the bulb's active time to replenish its nutrients. So once the foliage has died back and turned yellow, then you can cut it off. And number 7, weed early and often. I am a victim of this, I must admit. But catching weeds before they develop seeds is an important step to weed management. So be sure to weed frequently in small doses when weeds are young. If they're left to mature, many develop strong roots and they can get seeds that will spread around your garden very quickly. Try weeding early in the morning when the soil is moist and the roots are easier to remove. And tip number 8, refresh raised beds with compost and fertilizer. If you haven't refreshed your raised beds with compost and fertilizer, now's the time. You may have already planted your cool season crops, so wait until you turn the beds over to a warm season crop to add your large amounts of compost. Be sure when applying the compost, add about 3 to 4 inches into your garden beds. If your soil is still compacted, dig in or mix the compost. You can sprinkle with an all-purpose fertilizer over the beds and mix it into the soil, just like mixing a cake, right? And tip number 9, plant potatoes. Have you ever thought about planting potatoes? Potato plants can produce a huge amount of food when cared for properly. There are tons of interesting potato varieties, such as Purple Magic Molly or Tie-Dyed Masquerade. This is a great project to do with your kiddos. And last but not least, visit the San Francisco Botanical Garden to get inspiration. The San Francisco Botanical Garden is filled with blooms in the springtime. The show starts with their large collection of magnolias. The magnolia collection includes more than 200 trees, and it represents 63 different species. There are so many other spring flowers blooming through March as well, from rhododendrons to California natives, and there's a lot that looks good this time of year. So take your day trip and get inspired to plant your own garden this spring. There are tons of interesting potato varieties, such as Purple Magic Molly or Tie-Dyed Masquerade. This is a great project to do with your kiddos. And last but not least, visit the San Francisco Botanical Garden to get inspiration. The San Francisco Botanical Garden is filled with blooms in the springtime. The show starts with their large